I'm Patrick Masson. I'm the executive director at the Apereo Foundation. I'll talk a little bit more about Apereo. But I've been working at the intersection of open source and higher education for about 30 years. And I've had every role I can think of in both of those sectors. I was a student, graduate student, researcher, faculty, CIO, CTO for both an individual institution for a consortium of 15 campuses in Massachusetts. In the open source sector, I've been a user, an advocate, a developer, maintainer. I've run foundations. So what I'd like to talk today a bit about is how that ecosystem, open source within higher education, can serve to provide opportunities across all the sectors, so companies, projects, foundations, and so on. I will start off with an apology. Most of my references will be North American and institutions and English language institutions. However, I'm sure these are references that you would find across the globe and definitely in the EU and Europe as well. So I don't know if it's mandatory that this cartoon is presented in every technology presentation out there. I hear some groaning, so I suspect it is. And this is typically referenced to software stacks, dependencies associated with, and the vulnerabilities associated with software architecture and the organizations that support them. But I'd like to modify it a bit and use the same concept to raise issues with the services that allow for organizations to produce open source. So if you think of the open source tool as being composed of these blocks, this platform, this service, this system, whatever it might be, and there's the old joke now is that there's a person in Nebraska who's tirelessly maintaining this project and it's wobbling on the foundation. If it goes, the whole thing falls over. The same thing is true when you think about the organizations that support open source software. So there's funding, there's governance, there's community building, and so on. And if one of those things should happen to wobble, will it in fact topple the entire foundation and thus all the projects that are part of it? And there's a growing number of external pressures that are adding to the wobbability of that stack. And I'm talking not just about the software stack and the software projects, but also the communities of practice that support those tools and the development of those tools, and the communities themselves. So we've already talked a couple about them. Funding is the theme of the event. We've had mention of increased governance and regulation. The CRA is an example of those things. But all of these, and I'll talk about each in a little more depth going on, all of these are external pressures that are impacting the operational capacity and organizational structure of the foundations and the organizations that are providing the open source tools that we're all relying on. And these are just some of them that Apereo has identified that we're working to find support for. And the question is, can we, as an organization, provide all of these services? Or is there a better approach where we identify partners across sectors to create cross communities of practice, where we can find expertise and experience in different areas and ask them to collaborate, share information. Just coincidentally, I was speaking previously to the event starting up, and I hear Orange has 3 OSPOs that were mentioned. And what is the scope of an OSPO? Can it only be within an organization? Can it only be within a department within the organization? Can it span a sector? Same questions for foundations. What defines the scope of practice of a foundation and the scope of services that a foundation can provide? So when you look at this, what do you see? Is it an open source development lifecycle, or is it a research lifecycle? This is actually the Go Fair initiative, and it's Harvard University's recommended approach, principles, practices for researchers on doing their research on campus. And if you look at it, it's actually quite similar to the principles and practices of, well, in this case, the 4 freedoms, but the principles and practices of free and open source software development. This is from York University. And you'll notice, again, the commonality between the research development methodologies applied within the university and open source software development principles and practices. So accessibility, reusability, reproducibility, all those terms should sound pretty familiar to anyone working in open source. Here is UNESCO's Open Science Framework. And again, they emphasize reuse, repurpose, adaptation, and distribution. Again, this all sounds very familiar to you all, I'm sure. David Wiley, who's a professor at BYU, he's also the Education Fellow at Creative Commons, defined the open content definition. I guess that's another one for you that's already been taken care of, like the AI definition and the open source definition. But again, all of these 5 R's, what he calls the 5 R's, fit right into open source principles and practices. And in fact, David Wiley pointed to the open source definition as his inspiration for creating the 5 R's of openness. And in this context, openness refers to generally open educational resources. And if you were to speak to somebody on a campus, they would include open source software as an open educational resource. And I don't usually read directly from slides, but there's a few things I wanted to highlight here, and hopefully I can bold my voice so you get where I'm trying to emphasize. So it's inspire lecturers, researchers, managers, management of universities to design and implement actions that tap into potential of digital technologies and open educational practices. So those 5 R's and York's research template and framework and UNESCO's framework, those are the education practices to widen participation in education, encourage innovation in education, improve access to lifelong learning, and impart new digital skills and competencies needed for employment, personal development, and social inclusion. So they're using openness as a platform and as a set of tools to create outputs. And that's essentially what open source is. It's just software. In this case, it's educational materials. And it's been picked up by UNESCO, Una Europa, which is I think it's 13, might be 11 universities, and the EU have all recognized this as best practice. That these approaches around openness create a better educational environment for academic and research institutions. And there are other examples of where open educational resources are being produced. There's open textbooks, there's massively open online courses, and then there's learning objects. So much like a library or some piece of open source code, I can create a learning activity and then share that with you all, and you can modify and adapt it. I eat my own dog food. So my course at University of Albany is online. The syllabus, anyone can take it. I've grabbed bits and pieces from other courses. I use 3 Creative Commons licensed texts as part of my course. My students love it. This course costs them nothing other than the expense of in the US tuition. And there's other open initiatives. There's the Open Science Framework, there's open data, there's open access journals. So, and folks here I'm sure are very familiar with these things, especially considering Orange's research activities in this building. So, quick pop quiz. What do you think all of these projects have in common? Anyone want to blurt out something? Well, they're all founded at or with universities. And if you download the PDF, the links there will take you to the histories. So I thought I'd take you on a brief tour of a university and the opportunities that working with universities and creating an ecosystem that combines universities and companies and foundations and government, where individual organizations contribute in areas of their own expertise and skills to the broader community. So, as I think Simon has said here, that there's enough foundations already, and I might argue that we have enough OSPOs, or are we going down the same road? I asked ChatGPT to list all the open source foundations it could find. And it gave me 100, and I challenged it to find 500, and it said it could. But notice the text there that this is a constantly evolving, so there's more coming all the time. And what we need is fewer starters of foundations and maybe OSPOs, and more joiners. That's the thesis of my statement here. So here's some easy examples. Infrastructure. Oregon State's open source lab has infrastructure that anyone can use in an open source project. Apereo's infrastructure is hosted there. That could be a resource that's made available across foundations. And you'll find that many institutions are running open source software already. Synopsys survey showed that 95% of ed tech, education technology, is open source. You'll find that campuses are deeply involved in open source development, assuming a GitHub account means that you're involved in open source development. And you'll find that universities are providing fiscal sponsorships, and they're providing support to nonprofit corporations. So these aspects are generally, this infrastructure aspect is usually the basics that a foundation needs to provide. And it's also the basic types of information that an OSPO might be working on. Moving to the next area that's impacting open source is the post-open source movement and the maintain the maintainer, the constant need for developers. Well, higher education is actively involved in training the next generation. So we have courses that are being developed and shared, like mine, that teach open source software. And then there's actually a group called the Professors of Open Source Education that are helping train faculty to use open source resources, both the content and activities, so learning open source skills, but also principles and practices for teaching courses at universities to students. The Apereo Foundation did a micro-conference with a group from Posse. It's available online. There's the link at the top. Students are also involved in clubs and activities and student groups, and therefore involved in open source projects where they're developing their own projects, they're working with companies. Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in New York has the ARCOS, which is a group of students. It's 1,200, I think it's about 1,500 now, yeah, 1,500 students that are involved. So higher education that's been trained, students that have been taught in core open source values are ripe for positions working with companies involved in open source. And again, there's another micro-conference where the professor that runs that program and the president of the club talk about ARCOS and the activities that they're doing. There's additional professional development, so graduate courses. So these are examples from research programs at University of California, Santa Cruz that are dedicated to open source research. There's professional development. When I was at the OSI, we worked with Brandeis University to develop professional development courses on the business aspects of open source. You'll find on campuses that they're full of folks who have day-to-day jobs working in the IT department, supporting open source projects, whether those are external to the campus or internally developed by the campus. And I took that map that had the 3,200 GitHub campuses, and I broke out which ones were just European. And this creates a peer network of folks that have well-trained staff, invested faculty, and engaged students in developing open source software. Many campuses are proud to tout their graduates moving on to work at big companies, many of these. So this is UC Davis, my alma mater, by the way, whose students, top 4 employees out of the engineering department are at Google, Apple, Intel, and Amazon. You'll find an invested, okay, that was not me. Okay. I am hexed. Nobody travel with me later. You'll find that faculty are engaged in a variety of research topics, and many of the outputs of that research, the software, for example, the data, for example, will be open. Many US and European organizations, granting organizations, require those outputs to be open. And the Apereo Foundation has been tracking open source projects coming out of higher education. And since 2021, we've found over 375 open source projects that began as part of a research effort on a campus and is now building a community of practice around it. The next pressure that's impacting open source projects, and I would say foundations and other support organizations, is government regulation. And we've mentioned this before. Again, there's a micro conference on this that Apereo ran with Mike Milinkovic of the Eclipse Foundation talking about government policy. And universities have a variety of centers of excellence. Many campuses are beginning to build and create their own campus open source program offices. Those offices help researchers and faculty with other open initiatives. In this case, Ohio University has their open data initiatives that will train faculty on best practices of managing assets. There's centers for technology transfer and IP management. Those are offered as services on campuses that are available to faculty and researchers. Just last week, I attended a session on open source licensing offered by Penn State University. And there's policy centers that are working to understand policies that's being put in place by government agencies and university responses to that. The upcoming FOSSI 2024 will be held at Portland State University, and they're providing event planning, event management. So all of those resources are available. And as we look at the next sort of pressure is issues with funding, and there is no open source business model. We've seen that some businesses may jeopardize the ongoing support of open source projects as things change, as business opportunities change, and ensuring the sustainability of those projects is not only a financial issue, but also providing all those other services, which in a sense is also a financial issue. However, universities are already well prepared in helping folks find research dollars, so grant opportunities and grant writing support. The National Science Foundation in the U.S. has the pathways to enable open source ecosystems. I was a reviewer on this grant, and the idea there is to take those projects that were developed within campuses and build communities around them for long-term sustainability. Sloan Foundation is providing funds to start OSPOs on campuses, and every school department has a development initiative of reaching out to companies for support around academic and research initiatives and facilities and all sorts of resources that are needed. I mean, if you look across this list, you'll see, I'm sure, several companies that any organization would want to work with. So at Apereo, what we're trying to do is take those resources that universities have and work with those campuses to partner with other organizations. So companies that might start an open source project and are looking for research partners, or other foundations that don't have resources dedicated to policy or legal. And we have a global community. Apereo has been around for about 25 years. And the idea is to group these organizations together and tap them so that they can serve multiple projects, a cross-community of practice that allows for more services to be provided without providing redundant, replicated services, and those are offered by experts within their field. So I'm just listing some of the campuses we work with. Here's our European community. So that we can develop this idea where we have a less wobbly ecosystem where everyone benefits through participation and collaboration and co-creation. And isn't that sort of what open source software is all about? So I think I still made it. I hope I did. I tried to rush through. But I don't have any time for questions, but I'll be around for the next couple of days if everyone's interested in talking about how education can support your projects and your community. Thank you.